Tov. Hi, everyone. My name is Michal Siegal. I'm a professor of Talmud in the Jewish Thought Department, and also I'm a board member of this center that is very, very dear to my heart. And I want to welcome you to the second panel of the day. And I also want to say thank you to the current head of the center, Oded, who I do not let retire when he needs to. So just so you know, he's going to be there forever. And for the amazing work they do at the center and behind the scene. It's been rough the couple of years, financially and keeping everything up and still managed to create an incredible center with collaboration and research galore, seriously, with very little resources. So congratulations. This is incredible and we're very proud of this. And I also want to say a few words in my other hat as the vice president of this university, vice president for global engagement. I see this center for the university, and I think I speak for the administration as a whole, as a very vital center for the university overall research activity, the global engagement that it has, past conferences, international conferences, bringing scholars in a time that, believe me, I think is extremely challenging for global engagement of the university, our university and other Israeli universities. So the center, the ability to create international connection between the center and the world in research is even more impressive at the moment. And as part of the administration, I want to welcome you all and say that this is really an achievement and an important one for the university. And especially when the title of this session, when does division become schism, right? Defining boundaries in religious communities, there isn't a better or more fit time to discuss exactly that. Even though we're talking mostly about the past in this session, we really need to think about the time we're living in that relation as well. Okay, so I'm done talking, and I'm here to present our first speaker for this panel. Yitzhak Moore is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Comparative Religion, a Rosenstreich Fellow, the Mandel School of Advanced Studies at the Humanities at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and a member of the ERC group there. Yitzhak serves as the secretary of the Center for the Study of Christianity at that university. His doctoral research focuses on political theology of Catholic and Jewish thinkers within the conservative movement in the United States over the past 3 decades. It examines the influences of religious elements on a political sphere, inter-religious relations in the United States, and issues of anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism. And he's going to talk to us today about between norms and procedures, authority and interpretation in the intra-Catholic schism over liberal democracy in the United States.
There is a question that has been circulating in American intellectual life with unusual intensity in recent years. Can the Catholic tradition coexist with liberal democracy in the United States? I'm going to call it the big question. It is debated in seminaries and law schools, in political philosophy journals, and most visibly in the pages of influential Catholic publications. Since roughly 2016, it has become one of the defining intellectual debates of American Catholic life. Now, I'm not going to answer the big question today. What I want to suggest is that before we can answer the big question, we need to ask a different question, a smaller one, that is in some ways more fundamental. This question is, who can answer the big question? How does a tradition like Catholicism decide something like that? What are the rules of the game, specifically for resolving a dispute of this magnitude? Who is authorized to speak? And what happens when the tradition's own authoritative texts seem to contradict each other? That is what I want to talk about today. You'll notice that I have highlighted 2 words, Catholic and United States. The reason is that this paper is about a particular tradition in a particular national context. But since this is a panel on schism and division, I hope the case may also raise broader questions. Some of the dynamics I described may perhaps be recognizable in different forms, in other traditions and institutional settings. As a background, let me give you the shortest possible version of a long history. The 19th century was, from Rome's perspective, a century of catastrophe. The French Revolution had dismantled the old confessional order. Liberal nationalist movements were challenging papal authority across Europe. And the idea of neutral, religiously plural state was not, for Rome, an abstract theory. It was part of a political crisis. In 1864, Pope Pius IX issued Quanta Cura, together with the attached syllabus of errors. These documents condemned freedom of conscience and religious liberty as legal rights. These were not presented as marks of progress. They were presented as errors, even as deliramenta, ravings or insanity. A few decades later, Pope Leo XIII warned against what he called Americanism, a cluster of ideas about individualism and religious pluralism, and the compatibility of Catholic faith with American democratic life. Leo regarded these tendencies as dangerous. In the United States, this warning reinforced an already existing Catholic tendency towards separation from the Protestant majority. It gave theological weight to a defensive posture that many Catholic immigrant communities already felt. Then, over the 20th century, the picture began to change. The key figure here is John Courtney Mary, an American Jesuit theologian. Mary argued that the American constitutional arrangement and Catholic doctrine were not necessarily opposed. For a time, this was controversial. He was told to stop publishing on the subject, but he was later invited to the Second Vatican Council as a peritus, theological expert. His voice was heard again. In 1965, the Vatican II issued Dignitatis Humanae, the Declaration on Religious Freedom. The document affirmed that the human person has a right to religious freedom. More precisely, it defined that right as immunity from coercion in civil society. For a time, it seemed to reverse the older Catholic posture. The 19th century papacy had condemned religious liberty as an error. Vatican II now appeared to affirm it as a right. So, the historical question became a doctrinal one. Did the church change its teaching? Or can Dignitatis Humanae be read in continuity with what came before? Here is the heart of the problem. On the left, Quanta Cura, Pius IX, 1864, condemns religious freedom as a universal legal right. On the right, Vatican II, 1965, declares the human person has a right to religious freedom. The contrast is stark. These are not two documents that can be easily reconciled. They appear to say opposite things. And this creates a serious problem for Catholics. If the church teaches that it speaks with divine authority, and if two authoritative moments in its history appear to contradict each other, which one do you follow, and who decides? For roughly 50 years after Vatican II, the answer seemed, if not settled, at least stable. The council had spoken. The church seemed to have accepted religious freedom as compatible with Catholic doctrine and with modern constitutional democracy. Then came the last decade. And here you will find a connection with what Professor Halbertal spoke a few minutes ago. Since roughly 2016, a school of thought has re-emerged with considerable intellectual force. It goes by the name Integralism. At its core, integralism holds that political life cannot be religiously neutral. Civil authority on this view must ultimately be ordered to the church's higher spiritual authority, at least in matters concerning humanity's final end, religion. Two figures help clarify the broader intellectual shift. Patrick Deneen, a political theorist at Notre Dame, makes the broader post-liberal case. In Why Liberalism Failed, his book, he argues that liberalism is not simply flawed or incomplete. It is self-undermining. By making autonomy and neutrality its highest principles, liberalism slowly dissolves the communities and moral frameworks that make genuine human flourishing possible. Adrian Vermeule, this guy, a professor of constitutional law at Harvard, pushes this critique in a more explicitly institutional direction. If liberalism is not morally neutral, then courts, agencies, and constitutional interpretation should be reoriented around the conception of the common good. For Vermeule, this also means that civil power should recognize the church's higher authority in matters concerning religion. What matters for my purposes is the direction of the challenge. If liberalism is not neutral, then religious freedom cannot be treated as merely procedural. For integralists, the state should not protect religious liberty in a way that enables the spread of doctrinal error. This puts integralism in direct conflict with Dignitatis Humanae. And so we are back to the contradiction. Now, let me pause for a moment and clarify the other side of this debate. The critics of integralism, sometimes called neoconservative Catholics, are not theologically liberals. They are conservative Catholics committed to traditional moral teaching and deeply critical of liberal neutrality. But they also defend liberal democracy, religious pluralism, and the legacy of Vatican II. So the disagreement is not simply between tradition and liberalism. It is disagreement among Catholics who share much of the same moral critique of modern liberal society. Both sides reject the idea that liberal neutrality is philosophically coherent, but they draw different conclusions. Integralists argue that civil authority should ultimately be ordered to the church's higher authority. The conservative critics argue that liberal democracy can still provide a legitimate framework for Catholic life after Vatican II. And that brings us to the prior question. Did Dignitatis Humanae settle this issue or reopen it? I want to suggest that this debate operates on three distinct levels. Distinguishing them is essential for understanding what is actually being argued. Level one at the top is the normative debate. What political order is actually best? Should Catholics seek an integralist order in which civil authority is ordered to the church, or can liberal democracy, religious freedom, and pluralism still serve genuine Catholic ends? This seems like the main arena, but the evidence is too ambiguous to settle the question on its own. Level two is the hermeneutical debate. Is there actually a contradiction in the church's own authoritative documents? Can Dignitatis Humanae be read in a way that is consistent with the 19th century encyclicals? Or does it genuinely overturn them? Level three is the authority debate. When there is a genuine disagreement about interpretation, who decides which text, which tradition, which institution has the final word? I am focused now on the levels 2 and 3, specifically on the relationship between interpretation and authority. My argument is that these two levels cannot really be separated. In this debate, every interpretation depends on an assumption about authority, and every authority claims depends on an interpretation of the tradition. That is what makes the debate so difficult to resolve. So let us now enter the hermeneutical level. The hermeneutical question is simply this: is there actually a contradiction? The most sophisticated answer from the integralist side comes from Thomas King of King's College, London. King argues that the apparent contradiction rests on a misidentification of what Dignitatis Humanae is actually about. Dignitatis Humanae, King insists, is a declaration specifically about the coercive authority of the state. It says the state lacks the authority to coerce people in matters of religion. But, and here is the crucial move, Pink argues that the traditional teaching, properly understood, had already denied that the state possessed such authority in its own right. Pink traces the older doctrinal grammar back to the Council of Trent and to its classic theological formulation in Robert Bellarmine. Trent matters here because for Pink, it shows that baptism places Christians under the church jurisdiction. So the 19th century teaching was not simply about what the state may do, it was about what authority the church had over the baptized. Pink mentions Trent and Bellarmine because he wants to show that this is not merely his own reading of Dignitatis Humanae. He's claiming that there already was an older and authoritative Catholic framework for thinking about religious coercion. Within that framework, the state never possessed religious coercive authority in its own right. Such authority belonged to the church. Therefore, Pink concludes, Dignitatis Humanae changes nothing at the level of doctrine. What changes is policy. The church has decided for now not to ask the state to serve as its coercive arm. But the underlying doctrinal structure, the church authority over the baptized, remains intact. Now we can read, Dignitatis Humanae in no way contradicts the doctrinal basis of the church's previous endorsement of religious coercion. The church's own authority to coerce religiously was preserved, while the state's right to coerce religiously was constantly denied. But not everyone reads the documents in this way. Robert Miller, a Catholic legal scholar, looks at the same text and reaches the opposite conclusion. Let's read. If the Second Vatican Council contradicts earlier teachings of Doctrina Catholica, I'll explain it in a moment, in papal encyclicals, as it obviously does, those teachings must be regarded as abrogated. For Miller, the contradiction is real. It is visible. It should be acknowledged. And the question becomes, which teaching governs? Notice what has happened. We began with a question about what the church should do in the world. We have arrived at a technical dispute about what specific documents actually said. The normative debate has generated a hermeneutical one. And the hermeneutical dispute, as we are about to see, immediately generates a question of authority. Now, suppose we accept with Miller that the contradiction is real. The question becomes, which teaching governs? This is where the authority debate begins. And here Miller introduces a distinction I want to explain carefully because it is doing a lot of work. In Catholic doctrine, not all teaching carries the same weight. At the highest level, our teaching defined ex cathedra, that is, by the Pope exercising his supreme teaching authority, which explicit intent to bind the whole church on a matter of faith or morals. Such teachings are defeated, permanently and definitely binding on all Catholics. Think of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. This cannot be changed. Below this level is what tradition calls Doctrina Catholica, authoritative church teaching requiring serious assent, but open in principle to revision by later exercise of the magisterium, the church teaching authority, such as an ecumenical council. Miller's argument, 19th century teaching on the confessional state was always in this second category. The 19th century popes never formally defined it ex cathedra. No ecumenical council had ever proclaimed it as divinely revealed. Therefore, the Second Vatican Council, itself the highest collegial expression of the magisterium, had the authority to revise or reformulate, and it did. This is broadly consistent with what Pope Benedict XVI said in 2005. He called for reading Vatican II through a hermeneutic of reform, continuity at the level of permanently binding doctrine, genuine change at the level of historically conditioned application. And here is the point I find most analytically interesting. I want to show you why this debate does not move in a straight line. It moves in a circle. So let me walk you around the circle slowly. Pay attention to the colors, green for interpretation and blue for authority. We begin at the top left with the most obvious question. Do the texts contradict each other? Oh, sorry. Does Dignitatis Humanae contradict the earlier papal teaching on religious freedom? Pink says no, Miller says yes. At first, this looked like a purely textual question. We might think we can answer it simply by placing the documents side by side and comparing what they say. But that is exactly where the difficulty begins. To decide whether the texts contradict each other, we first have to decide which authority sets the term for reading them together. That takes us to node 2, the question of interpretive authority. Which authority has interpretive priority? Or, put more simply, which authority determines how these texts should be read together? For Pink, the Council of Trent and Bellarmine are not simply historical background. They represent the older doctrinal grammar through which Vatican II must be read. If the older grammar controls the reading, then Dignitatis Humanae does not look like contradiction. It looks like continuity. Vatican II denies only the state's independent authority to coerce in religion, while leaving untouched the older doctrine about the church's own authority. For Miller, Vatican II cannot simply be subordinated to the older texts. It is itself an authoritative act of the magisterium, capable of reformulating earlier teaching. So the dispute is no longer only do the text contradicts, it has become which authority controls the reading. But that answer does not end the matter. To justify why one authority should frame the other, we have to interrupt the earlier teaching itself. What exactly did it teach? And what kind of teaching was it? That takes us to node number 3. There are only 4, so don't worry. Node 3 is the second hermeneutical question. But notice, this is not simply a repetition of node 1. Node 1 asks whether the older teaching and Dignitatis Humanae contradict each other. Node 3 asks how the older teaching itself should be understood. Was the earlier teaching a permanent doctrine about the church's coercive authority, or was it authoritative but reformable teaching, serious binding but not irreversible? Pink reads the older teaching as continuing doctrine. On his account, the church's coercive authority over the baptized was never denied. The state never possessed religious coercive authority in its own right, coercive authority in its own right. It could act only as the church's agent. So Dignitatis Humanae changes policy, but not doctrine. Miller reads the oldest teaching differently. For him, it belongs to Doctrina Catholica, authoritative teaching that require assent but was not defined irreformably. Therefore, Vatican II could revise or abrogate it. And here the circle tightens, because the question of what the earlier teaching was cannot itself be settled without asking who has the authority to classify it. Note 4 is the authority behind the rules of interpretation. In other words, who has the authority to define the doctrinal grammar by which the tradition is read? Pink's answer is the older doctrinal tradition, especially Trent and Bellarmine, they provide a controlling grammar. Miller's answer is the later magisterium, including Vatican II. It has the authority to determine that an earlier non-definitive teaching was reformable. So again, we are not dealing with interpretation alone, we are dealing with the authority to authorize interpretation. And once we decide who authorizes the doctrinal grammar, we are sent back to the original question. Do the text contradict? I want to be precise about what kind of circle is it. It is not a circle of bad reasoning. Neither Pink nor Miller is simply making a logical error. The circle is structural. Every hermeneutical move in this debate turns out to require an authority assumption that has not yet been independently established. And every authority claim turns out to require an hermeneutical judgment that itself is dispute. To conclude, let me draw the threads together. We begin with the big question: can the Catholic tradition coexist with liberal democracy in the United States? Instead of answering it, I've tried to describe the structure of the debate itself. Here, what I've argued, the conflict between integralists and conservative Catholics committed to liberal democracy operates on three levels: normative, hermeneutical, and authority. The normative debate has proven inconclusive. The real energy has migrated to the hermeneutical and authority levels. And there is something structurally significant has occurred. These two levels have become mutually formative. Each side offers an interpretation that already assumes something about authority, and each side makes an authority claims that already depends on a contested interpretation of the tradition. I'm on my last page. At this point, Al-Sada McIntyre gives us a useful way to name the structure I have been describing. When disagreements between contending views are sufficiently fundamental, those disagreements will extend even to the answer to the question of how to proceed in order to resolve those same disagreements. This structure is not peculiar to Rome. Wherever fundamental disagreements arises within an authoritative order, religious, constitutional, or political, the question of who decides how to resolve them turns out to be inseparable from the normative commitments that generated dispute in the first place. There is no neutral procedure awaiting on the other side of the argument. There is only the prior question of what kind of order we take ourselves to be inhabiting. And that question is is contested. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Yoni Mos. It says a PhD Yale, 2013. I know that personally. We were students at Yale together. I graduated a few years earlier. Holds the lead senior lectureship in comparative religion at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, chairs the Department of Comparative Religion, and serves as the director of Hebrew University, can't say that name, Center for the Study of Christianity. He works on the history and comparative study of the Abrahamic religions and on the relations between them. He is the author of Incorruptible Bodies, Christology, Society and Authority in Late Antiquity, and a wide range of articles on the Abrahamic religions and the relations between them in the Mediterranean basin and beyond during the first millennium and beyond. Yoni is going to talk to us about,
It's a different topic. Don't.
Oh, on a different topic.
No, same topic, different title.
You have
Thank
20
you.
minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers, Melissa and Yishai and Adid. Thanks for having me. And here we go. The so-called Donatist controversy, which raged in 4th and 5th century North Africa, was famous for defining Catholic ecclesiology. It stars in popular imagination, mostly thanks to the central role played by the most famous of Western theologians, Augustine of Hippo. But there were, of course, many other people involved, both on the so-called Catholic side, to which Augustine belonged, and on the opposing Donatist side. Many writings and other kinds of evidence survive for both sides of the debate, but my focus today will be on Augustine. One interesting thing about the Donatist controversy is that unlike many others that lead to sectarian division, this one may be said to have been a meta-controversy. The issue at stake was procedural. How does the church deal with leaders within it who do not live up to its own standards? In other words, rather than arguing about this or that question in the ideal faith or practice, as we usually find in religious disputation, the parties of this debate agreed on all those ideals. What they did not agree about was what happens when clergy, whose role it is to make people Christian through baptism and to make Christian priests and bishops through ordination, what happens when these men's behavior fails to meet the church's ideals? Specifically, what is the church to do with a bishop ordained by another bishop who handed over sacred books to the Roman persecutors during the state-sponsored persecution of the early 4th century? What does one do with people baptized by priests who were ordained by such a bishop or by someone in the succession of bishops ordained since? Does the preservation of those corrupt elements corrupt the whole body, as the Donatists claim, or not, as their Catholic opponents argue? And what, therefore, is the proper attitude to have towards members of the opposite persuasion within this very controversy itself? Modern scholarship, following the lead of the ancient sources, usually paints this controversy or schism between Donatist rigorism and Catholic tolerationism as essentially a debate between purity and unity. In Donatist ecclesiology, the church was defined by its purity, despite the cost of thereby excluding many unknowing believers. In Catholic ecclesiology, by contrast, the church is defined by its unity among many believers, even if they are tainted with impurity. We may think of similar questions within current political contexts or other contexts. What is more important? Adherence to undiluted ideological purity or practical compromise in the name of broad consensus? Completely unaware of this 4th and 5th century controversy in Latin North Africa, a series of Greek and Syriac bishops were thrown into very similar debates in late 5th and early 6th century Palestine, Syria, and Egypt. Here too, the debate was between people who agree on substance but differed on procedure, with one side favoring rigorism and the other what we may call tolerationism. The controversy erupted within the large and diverse community of Christians in the late ancient Eastern Roman Empire who had vehemently rejected the Christological two-nature definition of the Imperial Council of Chalcedon in 451. This anti-Chalcedonian group fought hard to convert the heretical imperial church back to one-nature Christology, and even enjoyed some temporary success in the 510s under the leadership of Severus, Patriarch of Antioch. During this period of limited success and in the years before and after it, the debate was how to treat Chalcedonian Christians, and it manifested in two practical questions. The first of these was, does a repentant Chalcedonian who wishes to embrace the anti-Chalcedonian faith need to be rebaptized? And if not full rebaptism, might they require rechrysmation? Chrismation being the anointment with oil consecrated by a bishop immediately following baptism, which confirms the baptized incorporation into the church's body. Severus of Antioch, like Augustine before him, but without knowing about him, strongly opposed elements within his community who demanded rebaptism. Although himself a staunch proponent of the anti-Chalcedonian cause, who considered Chalcedonianism sheer heresy, Severus also objected to the rechrysmation of Chalcedonian converts. The second practical question that arose in the anti-Chalcedonian context found no equivalent in the Donatist controversy because it centered on an Eastern custom that only penetrated the Latin West in the 7th century. The custom, called the diptychs, involved the reading out during the celebration of the Eucharist the names of people venerated by the church. These typically included both famous patriarchs and church fathers of the past, and less famous bishops and saints of local interest. When Severus's colleague, the monk Philoxenus, was appointed bishop of the northern Syrian town Mabug, he erased from the diptychs the names of his Chalcedonian predecessors. In doing so, he followed a popular anti-Chalcedonian custom inherited from the previous generation. Severus, by contrast, professedly broke with this custom, ruling in the name of unity of the churches, which extends to many countries and and churches that the Chalcedonian heretics not be expunged from the diptychs. That was a quote from Severus, in the name of the unity of the churches. Despite their very different linguistic, historical, and geographical contexts, and despite Severus showing no knowledge of Augustine or his struggles, Severus's arguments against the rigorists within his anti-Chalcedonian camp bear striking resemblances to Augustine's polemic against the Donatists. It is also striking that in both cases, it was the tolerationist camp that ended up carrying the day. Part of the victory was due, no doubt, to Augustine and Severus's respective abilities to recruit allies. Augustine famously had both the Bishop of Rome and, more importantly, imperial might on his side, and Severus convinced many other Eastern bishops to toe his line. The purpose of this paper is to suggest a way of looking at and describing these disputes that, to the best of my knowledge, has not yet been proposed for either one, let alone for both. This new way of looking is in fact enabled precisely by the binocular vision that their comparative study demands. Rather than reproducing the normal language of purity versus unity, something I myself did when studying the 6th century debate in an earlier work, now I would like to propose new terms, a new language for the analysis of both of these controversies, which I think may also be helpful to us in our broader, more widely comparative study of what this conference is calling intra-religious disputes and divisions. My claim in a nutshell is that the difference between the disputants in both these cases may be redescribed as a difference between temporality and spatiality, or in other more abstract words, as a difference between verticality and horizontality. To get to this language, we first need to introduce 3 specific points of similarity between Augustine and Severus in their respective engagements with rigorous tendencies within their communities. The first point is one that Augustine is famous for, and one that I've argued for in a previous work I've done on the link between Christology and ecclesiology in Severus. In Augustine's case, it is the notion that the church is a corpus per mixtum. It is a body that is ideally incorrupt, pure and holy, but in its historical manifestation, it suffers from corruption, imperfection, and impurity. Invoking Neoplatonic ideas about the gradations of reality, Augustine argues that the true church encompasses both its ideal structure with its perfect sacraments and its concrete reality of a church on earth with imperfect priests whose sinfulness does not disqualify the holy sacraments administered at their hand. Severus develops a similar ecclesiology, intimately linked to his Christology, where he argues that the physical body, like the social body of Christ, is both incorruptible and corruptible. Historically speaking, Severus writes, quote, "There is no time in which we see the church to be pure." The second point of similarity between Augustine and Severus has to do with their engagements with the mid-3rd century bishop of Carthage, Cyprian. Although Severus was unaware of the more recent Donatist controversy, he was well aware of Cyprian's rulings in the context of the Roman imperial persecution of the mid-3rd century, not dissimilar from the debates of Augustine and the Donatists. On the one hand, Cyprian was relatively tolerationist in his approach to priests and bishops who had lapsed during the persecution. On the other hand, he was an advocate of rebaptism, and his rulings on the matter became incorporated into several Eastern councils in Greek, and thus were known not only to Augustine, but also to Severus. Both men take on the challenge of explaining how, despite Venerable Cyprian's endorsement of rebaptism, they, Augustine and Severus, reject it. Augustine claims that Cyprian changed his mind over time. Severus, that subsequent councils rejected Cyprian's opinion. In one of his letters, Augustine writes, quote, "And although it is not found in the same records that Cyprian corrected that opinion, it is nevertheless by no means an unreasonable supposition that he did correct it." Severus, in one of his letters, takes a related but slightly different approach. Quote, "We ought to follow later principles adopted as a matter of expediency and for the sake of the union of the church, and not to be shackled by prejudices held by an earlier time. Each man ought to be constantly and at all times contending for the opinions which once won his approval and prevailed, but if anything better and more beneficial show itself, gladly accept it. Contrary to their opponents' frozen notions of patristic authority, the bishops of Hippo and Antioch argue that opinions change over time. And whether it be one man's position changing over the course of his lifetime, or collective opinions changing over the course of generations, church discipline is subject to a degree of historical relativism. The third and final point of similarity between Augustine and Severus that I would like to highlight is their repeated appeals to the church's broad geographical extension and unity within its diversity. Both men invoke John 19:23 to get this point across. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also took his tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. The universal Catholic Church is both diverse, like the clothes divided into 4 parts, corresponding to the 4 corners of the earth through which the church has spread, and unified, like the one undivided, seamless tunic. Augustine and Severus may be said to share a preference for spatiality over temporality. Against the rigorists who appeal to their unchanging adherence to previous generations, Augustine and Severus relativize the past and point to change over time. Space, rather than time, is the operative ideal. Geographical spread, diversity, rather than consistency, is the mark of the church's power. If time may be thought of as a vertical line and space as a horizontal one, we may briefly observe 4 other cases where Augustine and one more case where Severus subtly express their preference for horizontality over verticality in their intramural debates. As opposed to one of the favorite biblical images recruited by the Donatists, Noah's Ark, which floats above water, on top of it and separate from it, Augustine, in his letter to the Catholics, reads the same ark as horizontally interconnected to the water. Contrary to the rigorists, he interprets the ark's tar not as what isolated the ark from the world outside, but as that which connected the church to the world. Quote, "It is much more probable," says Augustine, "that the tar, a very strong glue and burning substance, signifies love. Since we are commanded to have this love among ourselves and towards all, for this reason the ark was coated with tar inside and out. And since it is written, love bears all things, in 1 Corinthians, the power of tolerance that preserves unity was signified by the tar, with which the ark was coated inside and out, precisely because we must tolerate the wicked inside as out, so as not to destroy the peace," end quote. In the same letter, Augustine also interprets the multiple animal species within the ark as foretelling of, quote, "the future spread of the church throughout all nations." Although the preference for Catholic horizontality was clear in this case, the denigration of Donatist verticality may be said to be somewhat muted. This is not the case in Sermon 271, delivered around the turn of the 4th and 5th centuries, where Augustine associates the Donatists with what is probably the most vertical image in the Bible, the monolingual Tower of Babel. His own ecclesiology he presents as the antidote to that tower. The Pentecost outpouring of the Spirit and the church's spatial spread across many lands in multiple languages. The Donatists, by contrast, quote, "have absolutely no share in this gift of the Holy Spirit, who hate the grace of peace, who do not hold on to the fellowship of unity, who break away in schism from the Church of Christ, which speaks all languages." As opposed again to the Catholic Church, which, quote, "through the whole world is so spread," Augustine applies to the Donatists in his expositions on Psalms, on the verse, "Let there come," he says, "death upon them, and let them go down into hell living." The Bishop of Hippo spells out the verticality of this curse with the following words, "Onto the lower places living, they go down." Finally, for the Donatist context, we may point to the interesting piece of information presented in the Carthage Conference of 411, set up as an imperial trial between warring parties of bishops. In his study of the acts of this conference, Thomas Grauman has shown how the Donatists consistently refused to sit down. In remaining standing, the Donatist bishops engaged in an act of symbolic communication. Grauman suggests various interpretations of this symbolism, but does not link it to the essential verticality of their cause, which I am arguing for here. Returning to Severus of Antioch, I would like to cap off with a passage from one of his letters defending his new custom of keeping Chalcedonian names in the diptychs. Calling on an interesting distinction in the Levitical purity laws, Severus writes, "In fact, in Leviticus, we find something like this written, where it is dealing with the pollution that is caused to anything by a dead body, as follows, quote, and all food that you shall eat on which water shall come upon, and there fall upon it any of these dead things, it is pollution, and every drink that you shall drink in any vessel is polluted. However, of springs of water and of pools of cisterns of water, they shall be pure." What then is that is made known to us, says Severus, that when certain men who are by themselves in a church or in one city or in monasteries make mention of the names of those who are under suspicion and of dead men, like the similarly small amount of water contained in a vessel, they are polluted by that mention, as if something dead were falling. But when churches of many provinces and of dioceses are held in one bond of faith and resemble fair fountains and pools and cisterns of water, the dead thing which has the property of polluting it, if it fall, cannot injure. Mention of this kind does no injury to their fair body of the church. Like Augustine, Severus recruits a horizontal image, the spread of many pools of water, to overcome a vertical challenge. How to allow impure names from the past to contaminate one's most holy ritual, and how to thereby allow a break with the venerable custom of previous generations that did exactly the opposite. What is the significance of these striking similarities between Augustine and Severus in their dealings with the rigorist elements within their respective communities? Why does it matter that they approach the question in what appears to be more spatial and horizontal terms, while their rigorist opponents stressed temporal continuity and verticality? Viewed structurally, one may wonder whether it may be the case that over the course of its institutional development, the Christian church or churches require both the vertical and the horizontal pulls to evolve and flourish. It is the ongoing tension between these two opposing vectors that propels the institution forward. The story, however, does not end here, but it does end in exactly 1 minute. So hold on. Limiting now our gaze to the West, it's not just that the Catholic Church needed the Donatists to push it to articulate through Augustine and others its ecclesiastical doctrine that preferred unity over purity, spatial extent and diversity over temporal continuity and consistency. For soon after the Donatist schism had subsided, Augustine became embroiled in another controversy about grace, this time with the British monk Pelagius and his followers. Against Pelagius's defense of human agency, Augustine argued for the absolute necessity of divine grace. As with the Donatist controversy, here too, Augustine tried to solicit help from international allies. But this time he was less successful and eventually found himself isolated from the Eastern theologians and to some degree even from Rome. Mark Edwards sums up well the situation that resulted. Quote, "If Africa could be right when Rome and the East were united in error, it was clear that geographical unanimity could not be a criterion of sound doctrine, and that in Augustine's eyes at least, the health of the ecclesiastical body could not be sustained if truth were sacrificed to peace. Thus, it now became clear that the creative tension between horizontality and verticality was not just between warring groups within the larger church body. It turned out to be a tension within the Catholic Church itself, or rather, more precisely and more dramatically, within Augustine himself, between the horizontalizing anti-Donatist Augustine and the verticalizing anti-Pelagian Augustine. This very tension would explode 1,000 years later when the Protestant reformers saw themselves as embodying Augustine in their fight against the Roman Church, which they described as latter-day Pelagians, while the Roman Church also saw itself as embodying Augustine in their counterattack against the reformers, whom they in turn treated as Donatists. And thus the story continues, but our chapter ends here. Thank you for your attention.
Everyone's behaving very nicely on the time, so good job. Our next speaker is Danny Lasker. Professor Danny Lasker is a Norbert Blechner Professor of Jewish Values, emeritus, but we do not allow him to go far, in the Ben-Gurion Department of Jewish Thought at Ben-Gurion University. He holds a BA, an MA, and a PhD, all from Brandeis University. He has taught at Yale, Princeton, Toronto, Ohio, University of Texas, University of Washington, Boston College, and other institutions. He is the author of over 300 publications in the fields of medieval Jewish philosophy, especially on the thought of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the Jewish-Christian debate, including the edition of a number of central Jewish polemical texts, and Karaism. His latest books are Karaism, an introduction to the oldest surviving alternative Judaism, published in London, 2022, and Delightful Words, Divrei Torah and Sermon, published very recently in 2025. Danny, this is yours. Wait. Rabbinite Jews and Karaite Jews, what are the differences? What are the similarities? 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Came all the way from Shkunatet to be here. In 10th century Baghdad, the prominent Karaite Yaqub al-Kirkasani recalls an incident in which he asked the Rabbinite Yaakov ben Ephraim al-Shami, about whom nothing else is known, why the Rabbinites, namely the followers of Rabbinic Judaism, as contrasted with the Karaites, the followers of Scripture, are willing to intermarry with Jews belonging to a group called Isawiya, the followers of the Messianic or prophetic pretender Abu Isa al-Isfahani, but not with the Karaites. Kirkasani apparently assumes that Rabbinite Jews who believe prophecy had ended long ago should not be willing to marry people who ascribe prophecy to someone who is not a prophet. Jacob ben Ephraim answered that intermarriage was possible between followers of Rabbinic Judaism and the Isawiya because they do not disagree over the issue of the festivals. According to this interchange, the Isawiya, unlike the Karaites, observe the same calendar as the Rabbinites, and therefore the two groups could intermarry. This exchange is curious for a number of reasons. First, we really do not know much about the Isawiya, neither their calendar nor their theology. We have only Kirkasani's say-so that the majority Rabbinites did indeed intermarry with the members of this group. Furthermore, we know from the Cairo Geniza there were quite a number of Rabbinite Karaite unions, with the ketubot, the marriage contracts, serving as prenuptial agreements in which the two parties would agree on how they would navigate the differences in calendar, dietary laws, menstrual purity regulations, and other outstanding issues which differentiated between Rabbinite and Karaite observance of Judaism. Be that as it may, Kirkasani teaches us something very important about Jewish pluralism. What divides Jews into different groups, or can cause an irreparable rupture, is not theology, but law. Theology is much less important than law when dealing with Jewish solidarity. In the Middle Ages, when fierce disputes broke out between rationalists and anti-rationalists, and in the modern period between Hasidim and Mitnagdim, there may have been bans and excommunications, but it was still an intra-religious controversy, not between different religions. There were times and places where theological disagreements led to clear boundary markers, such as refusal in the 1960s of British Orthodoxy to accept Rabbi Louis Jacobs as chief rabbi or principal of Jews College. Despite universal agreement as to Jacobs' scholarship and commitment to observance of Jewish law, the non-traditional views of divine revelation, his non-traditional views of divine revelation of the Torah, led to his being forced out of the Orthodox community. Nevertheless, Jews have historically been much more tolerant of ideological dissent than legal deviance. I might add one more important criterion for inclusion in the Jewish community, which will be important for the discussion here. In the Passover Haggadah, the wicked son's questioning the necessity of celebrating Passover is interpreted as its desire to separate himself from the Jewish people, and thus a form of heresy. The Haggadah seems to be telling us that in such a case it is legitimate, in a sense, to treat the separatists as no longer Jewish. Inclusion in the Jewish people is a matter of how one identifies oneself, not necessarily how one observes or does not observe the commandments, and certainly not what theological beliefs one holds. Karaite history represents the understanding of heresy and represents this understanding of heresy and Jewish attachment. The Jewish status of Karaites was well accepted for centuries by all concerned parties, Rabbinite Jews, Karaite Jews, and the non-Jewish societies in which the Jews found themselves. It is true that Anan ben David, the putative but not actual founder of Karaism, prohibited the consumption of chicken, raising the question as to how Jewish the Karaites could be if they did not drink chicken soup. Yet in contrast, the aforementioned Yaakov al-Kirkasani reports that no two Karaites agreed about anything, and the situation got worse from day to day. Obviously, that sounds like Jews. And eventually the Karaites, in contrast to the Ananites, began eating chicken as well. Over the centuries, Karaites and Rabbinites were part of one social polity. They generally lived in the same neighborhoods, despite 12th century Benjamin of Todila's account of a wall between the Rabbinite and Karaite sections of Constantinople. Rabbinites and Karaites paid the same taxes, whether it was the Muslim jizya for protected minorities or the taxes in Poland handled by the Council of the Four Lands. They were slaughtered together during the Khmelnytsky uprising. They spoke the same languages, at least until they relocated to Eastern Europe, where the Rabbinites coming from the German-speaking West spoke Yiddish, and the Karaites coming from the East spoke a special Turkic language. There are cases of Jews who threatened to leave the synagogue of their faction in favor of one belonging to the opposing group if they were not treated fairer or better in their own original synagogue. Only in the late 18th century, when the areas of Karaite residence were conquered by Prussia, Russia, and Austria, and the latter two countries initiated anti-Jewish legislation, did Karaites start to move away from Jewish solidarity, adopting origin stories which divided them from Rabbinite Jews. In the 20th century, the break was complete, and many Karaites survived the Holocaust specifically because they claimed they were not racially Jewish, being descendants of Central Asian tribes. This denial of Jewish solidarity, Allah, the wicked son of the Haggadah, removed them from the community. While this separation was going on in Europe, Egyptian Rabbinite Karaite solidarity never wavered, as demonstrated by the 1955 public execution of two Jews, one a Rabbinite Shmuel Azar and one a Karaite Moshe Marzouk, for being Israeli agents. In Israel today, the largest Karaite community in the world, some members of whom are here with us today, is made up mostly of immigrants from Egypt and their descendants. Karaites are recognized as Jewish, enjoying the full Israeli citizen rights and responsibilities, such as serving in the army. Israeli Karaites complain of discrimination in terms of recognition and the inequitable division of resources, which are intended to support religious activities, but they are far from being the only group of Israeli Jews with complaints. The other large, formerly Egyptian Karaite community is in the Bay Area of California, and they also identify with the local Jewish community. My discussion today is therefore about two types of Jewish religion: Rabbinic Judaism, the one held by the majority of Jews around the world, and Karaite Judaism, which was once more widespread than it is today, but still claims approximately 50,000 followers around the world. I'll be talking about pre-Enlightenment, pre-secularization forms of these two Judaisms before many Jews, Karaites, and Rabbinites abandoned strict observance of their legal traditions. I might add that even if one assumes that secular Jews observe neither form of Judaism, I would still argue that overwhelmingly the type of Judaism the secular Jews do not observe is Rabbinic Judaism. To the extent that generally non-observant Jews do partake in a Jewish ritual, whether it be a Passover Seder or lighting the Hanukkah candles, they're doing it according to the rabbinic calendar and following rabbinic behavioral modes. As I used to tell audiences who were unfamiliar with the Israeli marriage system, if one believes in two Torahs, one is a Rabbinite. If one believes in only one Torah, one is a Karaite. And if one does not believe in any Torahs, one is again a Rabbinite. So what are the differences between Rabbinite and Karaite Judaism, and what unites them? Looking first at theology, we see that there are very few differences. The classic but not undisputed exposition of Rabbinite Jewish doctrines is Maimonides' list of 13 principles of Judaism. If we look at them and compare them with Karaite beliefs, we see that Karaites agreed with 12 and a half of the 13 principles, rejecting only the second part of the principle 8, namely the eternity of the Torah, because Maimonides states the eternity of the Torah includes the eternity of the oral Torah. And when Karaites listed their own principles of Judaism, usually 10 in number, there was nothing offensive in them to Rabbinite Jews. There are 2 principles on some Karaite lists: the necessity of knowing Hebrew and the centrality of Jerusalem, which are not on any Rabbinite list of principles, but they do not contradict any Rabbinite beliefs. Karaite philosophy runs parallel to Rabbinite philosophy. Both groups started their theological speculations with adherence to the rational principles of Islamic Kalam. Rabbinite Jews moved beyond Kalam as they adopted the Islamic version of Neoplatonized Aristotelianism, and despite what one reads in many histories of Jewish philosophy, that the Karaites always follow the Kalam, they too eventually caught up with the Rabbinite acceptance of Aristotle's philosophy. Sociologically, even when the 2 forms of Judaism coexisted, the communities were able to maintain their own individual identities. Given the ritual differences, including calendar, food, marriage laws, liturgy, and much else, it was necessary to maintain separate synagogues and food purveyors. The lines are not as sharply drawn in present-day Israel, where Israeli civil religion can unite secular Rabbinites and Karaites. A good example is Hanukkah, which Karaites never incorporated into their ritual calendar, but today is accepted by many of them as an Israeli civil holiday. I assume that most Karaites, if they light the candles at Hanukkah, they do not make a blessing over them. So what really separates Karaites and Rabbinites? The answer is the religious legal system of each group. Rabbinites are committed to the legal interpretation of the Torah as found in rabbinic literature and the legal codes such as the 16th century Shulchan Aruch. Karaites are committed to parallel legal interpretations, which in contrast to popular wisdom are not always based on a literal reading of the Torah and are also included in their legal codes, the most important of which was Elijah Basyachi's Aderet Eliyahu in the end of the 15th century. I've already mentioned in passing some of the legal differences between the groups. We'll try to summarize them quickly. The Karaite calendar, which used to be based on actual observation of physical phenomena rather than on calculation as in the Rabbinite calendar, is now also based on calculation, but different calculations than the Rabbinite calendar. This means that the holidays are often often off by a day or 2. Celebration of the holidays is also different, with no shofar in Rosh Hashanah, no 4 species, namely the lulav, etrog, myrtle, and willows on Sukkot, different fast days, no second day of the holidays in Israel or abroad, even for Rosh Hashanah, and Shavuot always on Sunday. Karaites refrain on the Sabbath from use of fire to heat cooked food, no cholent, as well as from sexual relations. The 2 groups prohibit eating the same species of animals, but the laws of slaughtering animals are slightly different, and the Karaites do not refrain from eating milk and meat together unless the meat and milk come from the same species, leaving the possibility, however slight, of ending up with a calf in its mother's milk. Liturgy is totally different, and Karaite synagogues are characterized by lack of chairs and full prostration during services. Purity laws are different, since Karaites, unlike Rabbinites, who mark only menstrual impurity, recognize other biblical forms of impurity, as well as ending the period of impurity with simple washing and not immersion in a ritual bath. The most significant differences are in the laws of personal status, namely who can get married and how, along with how to effect a divorce. These differences make marriage between the groups difficult, but not necessarily impossible, depending upon which rabbinate a mixed couple goes to get a marriage license. Should be remembered in the Mishnaic period, as Professor Halbertal mentioned a little while ago, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagreed about some fundamental incest prohibitions, and yet they intermarried with each other. This short survey of what unites and divides Karaites and Rabbinites might tell us something important about Jewish identity and peoplehood. The most important criterion for what unites or divides Jews is Jewish solidarity. Self-exclusion from the community determines whether one is considered Jewish by that community. Karaites in most of the Jewish world maintain a Jewish identity and were accepted by other Jews as part of the Jewish community. Karaites in Eastern Europe removed themselves from the Jewish collective and are thus not considered part of it by other Jews. Next in importance is ritual observance. Religious schism occurs when the different Jews cannot, as the movie title has it, eat, pray, and love together. But their religion is still Judaism because it's practiced by Jews. The least important factor in Jewish identity is theology, said by someone whose professional academic life has been devoted to a study of Jewish theology. Arguing as to whether God has a body can be fun or it can be vicious, but is certainly not enough to cause a schism. I can think of one exception to my conclusion, and that is a group known as Messianic Jews or Jews for Jesus. Members of this group identify as part of the Jewish people, are very supportive of the state of Israel, accept a majority, if not all, of Maimonides' 13 principles, and many observe Jewish law to one extent or another. Yet they're excluded from Jewish communities around the world. They cannot march as a group in the Salute to Israel parades, which was yesterday in Manhattan. They do not serve in Jewish community institutions. They are not solicited for funds for Jewish causes. Their children are not admitted into Jewish schools. In general, they are ostracized by other Jews to a much greater extent than Karaites ever were. I think the situation is not at all logical, but as a result of historical factors, namely the long history of Christian antagonism to the Jewish people. I guess that sometimes theory runs up against reality in unexpected ways, but that is the subject of a different talk. Karaite Judaism has existed for around 1,200 years, still surviving despite its perpetual minority status and the antagonism of Rabbinite Jews, which continues to this day, even in communities where there are no actual Karaite Jews, and opposition to Karaism is somewhat residual. I have tried today to outline the similarities and differences between the two groups and their significance in hopes of contributing to the topic of the conference, Inter-Religious disputes and divisions. Thank you.
And our last speaker for this panel, Kana Velman, is a professor at the Department of Jewish History at Ben-Gurion University. Her research concentrates on Jewish literature from the Hellenistic Roman era with a particular emphasis on texts from the Second Temple period. It involves a study of the development of halakha, Jewish Hellenistic thought, early Christianity, messianic expectation, apocalyptic literature, and the social political context influencing historical events and the people experiencing them. And today she's going to talk about From Israel to Judea and Samaria.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Oh, thank you for accepting my proposal. I have to apologize. I just came back from Italy. I had a very good time, but I'm quite tired. And so I try to do my best to read as fast as possible, so Michal wouldn't get angry at me. And but then maybe I will summarize a few paragraphs, so I will be on time. As the title indicates, this lecture examines the transformation of biblical Israel into Yehuda v'Shomron. That is a process that gave rise to two distinct ethnic Judeans who became Jews and the Samaritan. Beyond my general work as historian of this period, two specific lines of research prompt me to investigate this scheme. The first arises from the Book of Jubilees. See? You know, I deal with this subject for many years, which narrates a war between Jacob and the Amorite kings in the region of Mount Samaria. The second theme from the Book of Ezra and Nehemiah, having become the focus of my recent research into the priestly clan's rise to power in Second Temple Judea, this composite text has proven to be a pivotal source not only for tracing status of the priesthood, but also for understanding the roots of the Judean Jews Samaritan rupture. During the First Temple period, and we all know that we are talking about the same nation with two kingdoms, but they believe in the same God and they accept his authority. And we can see a very complex ties between the two kingdoms, sometimes hatred, sometimes wars, but sometimes sharing of political aims. Several examples highlight the intricate nature of the relationship between the two kingdoms. Amos, Judean, prophesies adversaries for the northern kingdom of Israel, yet he did so. He is from Tekoa, remember, but he's talking about the Parot Bashan, yet he did so in the name of the very God accepted by both peoples of the unlimited, or as the unlimited authority. The figure of Aharon, traditionally known as the father of the northern priesthood and the creator of the golden calf, was deeply integrated into the southern Judean book of Exodus. One of Judah's final kings was named Menashe, which is the father of the northern kingdom beside Ephraim. According to 2 Kings 17, this is a very important chapter, the Assyrian deportation of the people of Shomron in the final third of the 8th century BCE marked a definite turning point in these interconnected ties. The biblical narrative reports the total exile of the kingdom's population and the subsequent arrival of various foreign peoples. While these new inhabitants initially worshipped their own deities, such as Sukkot Banot, Negal, and Ashima, they eventually adopted worship of the local god of Israel out of fear of wild lions. We all know the story. The biblical author levels a series of shifting accusations against these newcomers to highlight their religious syncretism. And we can see here the 4 accusations. They continue to worship the native gods within their respective city. They worship the God of Israel at Bet Habamot, which is the name for Bet El, the central sanctuary of the northern kingdom. They worship both God of Israel and their native deities without a specific location, and also they place their own idols directly inside the shrine of Bet El. These incoherent accusations raise immediate suspicion, and this chapter is one of the most complicated one, and there's no solution yet. Where is Ariel? Is Ariel here? You know, you agree with me, right? No solution how this chapter was created and how many strata there are there. But what is important for us is that it contradicts other events or other accounts which are found in the Bible. For example, the one from 2 Kings 23, where you have Yoshiyahu, who is decided to make a reform and to purge the north some 80 years after the deportation of the kingdom of Shomron, Ephraim, Israel. According to 2 Kings 23, 15 to 16, Yoshiyahu destroys the altar at Bethel and demolishes additional high places throughout Samaria. Strikingly, the report makes no mention of foreign deities allegedly introduced by the Syrian deportees. Had the cult of Sukkot Benot, Nergal, or Ashima retain a prominent presence, the text almost certainly would have recorded a crackdown against them, just as it details Yoshiyahu venting his wrath upon a variety of forbidden cults within Judah itself. You see here Asherah and Batei HaKadoshim, right? But nothing of this we see in the report of his actions in the northern kingdom, which is not the kingdom anymore. 2 Kings 23 thus implies that the newcomer population and their unacceptable religious practices were historically marginal. As an episode in the book of Jeremiah supports this conclusion, where you have, we don't know exactly when it was written, but there is a report in Yirmiyahu 41 that 80 men from northern cities, Shechem, Shiloh, Shomron, marched towards the ruined temple of Jerusalem to offer grain offerings and incense. After being lured into Mitzvah, they were slaughtered by Yishmael ben Netanyahu, but the narrator drops no hint that these people who came from the north are foreigners. So we can see from both 2 Kings 23 and Jeremiah that the people of the northern kingdom are present who faithfully worship the God of Israel. So we can conclude that also that 2 Kings 17, this is a very difficult chapter, something is laid there. The layer that claim that all the people of the northern kingdom was taken to the east part of the Assyrian Empire, and that the people who sit there are foreigners. This is not true. So the question who made this claim, and we'll see later what I offer to in order to understand the development of this chapter. Admittedly, we do not know exactly how the northern population expressed its devotion to the God of Israel after Yoshiyahu demolished the altar at Bethel. Regardless, only 40 years later, in 586 BCE, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. At this historical juncture, both populations found themselves on the same geopolitical plane, stripped of political independence and lacking a central sanctuary. The very institutions around which their theological controversies had revolved for centuries no longer existed. So what will be next? So we have two prophets who prophesied about the future of this nation, which was divided into two kingdoms. One is Ezekiel and one is Zechariah. They both prophesied that at some point very soon, the two parts of the one nation will be united. The question or the dispute between them was who will benefit from this unification. For Zechariah, the beneficiaries are the current occupants of the land. From his perspective, the exiles had been dispossessed of the Lord's inheritance and would not return to claim it. Ezekiel held the opposite view, arguing that cardinal sins of those who remain in the land would lead their absolute elimination, leaving the returning exiles of both Yehuda and Israel, or Ephraim, Shomron, as the sole legitimate heirs for the land. So the question are the people inside the land will inherit Yirshu Aretz, or the people who were exiled will be the heirs of the land. Now we know that both Zechariah and Ezekiel, the prophecies never came about, and below yet. Go and look for the 10 tribes. Below are the, I would like to examine what went wrong. No unification between the two kingdoms or within the heirs of the two kingdoms. So, and this is my main point here. Okay, this is Zechariah, and here I relied on the Litrom Shiloni, very important paper. And here are the sources that I use when I try to understand what went wrong. And we have here some very important memoir of Nehemiah, as reconstructed by Natan Evron, very important doctoral thesis from the Hebrew University from two years ago. And then we have Mismacheyev, and we have the second stratum of Nehemiah's memoir, the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, which are different from Nehemiah's memoir and the second stratum of Nehemiah's memoir, archaeological finding from Samaria region, and some report from a historian. And we have also archaeological excavation from Mount Gerizim. And here I rely on Judy Magnus. I went to the SBL, the last SBL, and she gave a lecture. And she made it very clear that what we found there is from the 3rd century, not as Yitzhak Magen's claim that it is from the 5th century. And we have Ben Sira and the Prayer of Joseph report. You have all the sources in the Daf Mekorot, which I put in the site of this conference. And the end of the story is the destruction of the temple on Mount Gerizim, 111 BCE by Yochanan Horkenus. So about the memoir of Nehemiah, it's the earliest relevant source at our disposal. And this is, as I said, the result of a very important doctoral thesis of Natan Evron. It's not clear whether Nehemiah is the name of the person who wrote it, but it is some kind of a source. In this initial stratum of the text, the Jerusalem temple is depicted as fully functional, thriving institution whose legitimacy is entirely undisputed. So we are talking about some time after 516 BCE, which is the time of the construction of the Second Temple. And interestingly, the city walls of Jerusalem received no particular emphasis on this layer. It's not mentioned there. And Nehemiah does not recount any clashes with external enemies or adversaries. This absence of outside the threats suggests the province of Pachava security and geopolitical standing were reasonably stable during the core years of Nehemiah's or this main administration. There is, however, a rivalry inside Judea. The old elite does not like Nehemiah, and at the head of this elite stands Tuvia, who is part of the people of Jerusalem. Is not mentioned as outsider, he's an insider. According to his account, Nehemiah leveraged his authority to enforce a sweeping remission of debt, and he systematically collected temple tithes. He prohibited commerce on Shabbat and sharply rebuked the Judeans for failing to separate themselves from the neighboring ethnic groups, primarily the Phoenicians of the coastal plain, whose language closely resembled Hebrew. This is the Ashdodim. The language of the people there is very, very close to Hebrew, and this I learned from people who deal with the kinds of Canaanite languages in Aramaic and Hebrew of the Second Temple period. As a final critical historical note, Nehemiah appears to have been entirely unfamiliar with the written Torah. His sweeping social and religious reforms were neither grounded in explicit Mosaic commandments nor justified by citation of biblical verses. So here we have the starting point, and then we see that the same situation is echoed by the Alphantine Papyr or Kitvei Yev, where the people in Egypt, there was a hell matzav there of Judeans, and the temple was destroyed, and they wrote a petition to the people in Judea. And you see here a citation of this letter. What is important here is that we have both the governor of Judah and the high priest in Jerusalem as an addressee of this petition, but also the people in Shomron, Delaya and Shlemaya, sons of Sanballat. So the people in Egypt, the Judeans in Egypt, see the people of Shomron as their allies, as their brethren, if I use this term again. And we see here also important fact is that there's no high priest in Shomron, only in Jerusalem. And he's one of the people that the Chel Matzav in Yev were writing to. So we have some kind of the same unity as we found in the first temple period. Two distinct provinces, two distinct pachavot, but one nation, apparently with at least one central temple in Jerusalem. So it's some kind of a positive unification. The turning point apparently is around 400 BCE when the condition of the Persian Empire was shaking, and they had to withdraw from Egypt. At this point, apparently, they gave a permission to the people of Galut Bavel to come back. So Shivat Zion is not after the Koresh, Hatzarat Koresh, but it's around 400 BCE. And at this point, we see a shift. The people who came back from Babylon could not accept the Samaritans as their brothers. They could not accept actually the people of Judea as their brothers. They decided that the people who live in the land of Israel are Canaanites, and that's why intermarriage, it is intermarriage actually. These two papers record the shift 400 BCE. And what we understand is that because of this return, Shivat Zion, there is a hostile atmosphere toward the people of Judea and toward the people who live in Shomron. And this is the final stratum of Ezra and Nehemiah. And because of that, the people of Shomron decided to withdraw, to build their own temple. First, they built the temple in the city of Shomron. Then it was destroyed by Alexander Mukdon, and they got permission to rebuild the temple, but this time on Mount Gerizim. And at this point, they also claim that they are the right, they are Bnei Israel, they are Bnei Yaakov, and the temple of Har Gerizim is a Makom Asher Yivchar Hashem. That's what we find in the Samaritan Pentateuch. So there is a dispute, a very, very painful dispute between two ethnies, which was then founded because of this hatred which came from the people who came back from Babylon. Thank you very much.
Questions, anyone? We have time.
Thank you.